Welcome to the Smiling at the Future podcast. My name is Christy Rose, and this is my pursuit to glean practical wisdom on femininity, homemaking, finances, relationships, and singleness from the God-fearing men and women in my life. Hope you enjoy this journey with me as we learn to smile at the future. Hello, ladies. We are finally back from our extended summer break, and I'm ready to roll out some fantastic interviews with new and returning guests on a variety of topics, such as how to stop overthinking, how to move forward from your past, dealing with hormones and PMS, balancing recreation and play in the Christian life, and much more. But here today to launch us into our new season is one of our favorite guests, Chris Hamilton. And he walks us through some of the complexities of the engagement phase of a relationship. If you're thinking this topic doesn't apply to me, keep listening because he shares so many guiding principles that apply even to friendships with guys, and he highlights what conversation topics that should and should not be happening during dating. So without further delay, here is my conversation with Chris Hamilton. Well, welcome, Chris. You definitely don't need an introduction as you are a regular guest on this show, and I've lost count about how many times you've been on. But you've been so gracious each time I've invited you, I've suggested a topic, and I don't think you've turned down any topic I've thrown at you, and you cover it with such wisdom and insight. So I'm excited for today's conversation on engagement. But before we go into that, we are starting a new season. We probably have some new listeners joining us today. So if you could just briefly share about yourself and where the Lord has you in life and ministry.
All right. I'll start with one of the greatest achievements of my life just happened. Christy called me a regular on her podcast, and that is an honor. I am married to Ann. We've been married for 37 years. We have 3 daughters, 7 grandchildren with number 8 imminent. And I'm involved at Grace Community Church where I attend. I've been running around that place since about 1970. And Ann and I are involved in the singles ministry there in a midweek Bible study. And on Sundays, we work in 2-year-olds. So we're involved in children's ministry, and I'm involved in Men of the Word and a men's ministry at our church. And so it's busy ministry life. In my business life, I'm a forensic accountant. That's what I do most of the time, actually. And so that means I'm in court a lot, getting cross-examined by people not nearly as nice as Christy Rose.
Well, even though you have such a full schedule, Chris, you never seem like you're overwhelmed, and you always respond to my requests promptly, and I just so appreciate that. And you taking the time today. And on this podcast, we have covered different stages of a relationship. On several ones, you've covered what to look for in a man, how to vet a man's character. And today we're moving into the engagement stage of a relationship. And a lot of couples or a lot of women, when they think of engagement, they may be thinking solely about just planning the wedding day and all that entails. And while that is an important focus, there is so much more, and we're going to cover some great questions that you can store away if you're not currently engaged, or you can send this episode to a friend and it'll hopefully be an encouragement for them if they are in this stage right now. So most Christian couples will be in the context of a church, and they'll have the opportunity to go through premarital counseling. So for those maybe not familiar with what that is, can you share what a couple can expect? What are the contents and the benefits of premarital counseling? And should every couple pursue this before marriage?
Yeah, so premarital counseling can mean a lot of different things, and you indicated an assumption that everyone in the audience is in a church or in the church somewhere, and some couples actually go to premarital counseling outside the church, and I think it's really important to make the distinction that in the church is the best place to do that. Hopefully that's where your personal relationships are. You're going to get hopefully Bible-based teaching, and we call it counseling, and I understand why, but it really is an environment for very targeted teaching. And I know when I got engaged 38 years ago, I thought I knew what I was getting into, and I don't. And the reason is I'd never been married before. And that's true of every couple that is going through this process. So in the church context, generally the content is going to focus on the roles of a husband and a wife, probably right out of Genesis 2, among other places, go way back to the beginning where it's laid out pretty clearly what the roles are. And then a practical application then of that really is what happens in premarital counseling, because what the Lord laid out for the man and the woman in a marriage is pretty clear. It seems easy to understand, and it is easy to understand, but the complexity of applying it and living it is the challenge, the mystery, and even the adventure of life together with another person. And the practical topics that would be covered in premarital counseling are issues like handling money together, dealing with in-laws, handling disagreements, because two sinners coming together, no matter how godly they are, will have disagreements, and there will be an adjustment to life with another sinner. And how do you handle that? And then expectations. Various people have different expectations about what married life is going to look like. If you've spent a lot of time watching movies and television shows, you might even have a very defined view of what marriage is, and it might actually be very skewed. And that's where premarital counseling is very helpful. And when I referenced earlier about doing it in the church and the relationships that are there, the best premarital counseling, I think, is with another couple. I mean, some churches do a class. We do a class at our church, and that's great. But as a part of that class, there would be great benefit to being in touch, spending time with, not extensively. It doesn't have to be a huge time commitment because there's a lot going on in engagement, but occasionally sitting down with another couple and asking, what does this actually really look like? And that's you know, that's where you can glean some wisdom. For example, in our premarital, the couple that led our premarital class gave some advice that we've never forgotten. 37 years later, we still think about this. And the simple wisdom was the most important 20 minutes of the day are the first 5 minutes when you wake up, the last 5 minutes before you part for the day, the first 5 minutes when you come back together, let's say after work or whatever, and then the last 5 minutes of the day. And in the premarital counseling class, we noted that. And then we got married and we realized, my goodness, that's nowhere in the Bible. That's not a biblical principle. But wow, is that wise? And just to be aware of that dynamic. So that's the kind of thing you can pick up in premarital counseling. And I bet in our class, we're the only ones that remember that. But it just hit both of us. We talked about it at the time, and we found in our own marriage how critical those 20 minutes every day really are in our relationship. And the other thing, having another couple walking you through premarital counseling, is your vows, helping you pick your vows, write your vows, whatever you're going to do with your vows. Those vows are extremely important. And a lot of people think, we'll just do what every couple's done for 600 years and we don't really care what it says. A good premarital counseling program will walk through vows and make sure everybody understands what you're committing to. So the benefits of all of this is there's accountability in a very important time of life. There's practical help and wisdom. I think having an older couple, a married couple involved, there's a lot of encouragement because engagement can be a rough period. And I think we'll probably talk about this later, but probably the least romantic phase of any relationship, and it's not just me and Ann, but we've seen this over and over and over, is the engagement period. There's a lot of stresses. There's a big party that has to be planned called a wedding. And there's the merging of living arrangements and finances and some just huge change. It's great fun, but it can create some tension and pressure, and having an older couple encouraging you and also reminding you of what this is all about. This whole thing is about a marriage, not a wedding. The danger of premarital counseling, you didn't ask this, but just to throw this in there, is when you go through it, you accumulate methodologies rather than principles. So I gave the example of the most important 20 minutes of the day, and I made a point to say that's not biblical. and that but it's not a methodology either. The principles behind that are how you set the tone and think of each other rather than yourself in those 20 minutes makes all the difference in the world. And that's a biblical principle of thinking of others as more important than yourself. It's that kind of thing. So I think every couple should, and I would say even must, pursue premarital. And it's funny, we always recommend couples to do it again after the wedding, because in the engagement period, it's pretty much all theory. And it's all framed in rose-colored glasses of romance and love and excitement, and that's all good. It's great. Once you've had the wedding and you've been married for 6 months to a year, it's really, really, really helpful to go back through that material. And at our church, I tell newly married couples that we've done premarital with, go back through and take that class again, because it's not theory anymore. Now, everything they say is probably the same, but now you're on the other side, and you don't need another couple to make the application. You'll be able to make it.
Helpful points, Chris. I appreciated how you talked about that it doesn't need to be a huge time commitment, doesn't have to be something that you're doing weekly meetings for 6 months on, that there is flexibility there with what the couple has time to do and what they're willing to invest in. And of course, the people that are doing the counseling, what they have time for. But I'd love to go back and I like how you talked about there's a difference between methodology and principle. So how would someone discern when they're hearing advice, is this principle or is this methodology? Is there kind of a filter or grid that'll help them understand those two things?
Yeah, I think, we're called to purposeful living. You think of Ephesians 5, be careful how you walk as those who are wise with a reason. And I think that's the framework. So if a principle is something that's applicable in all kinds of situations. So whether you're feeling well, you're not feeling well, whether you're busy, you're not busy, these are principles that tie back to scripture. That's the principle. So, for example, the biblical principle is to be kind to one another, forgiving one another. That's biblical principle. How that looks, if I hear in a premarital class that I need to, in marriage, take the trash out every morning before I leave for work, because that will express kindness. Well, that's a methodology that may not communicate anything to my wife other than she may think that is making a statement that she's not keeping a clean house. And so that's what I mean by grabbing a methodology and running with it and thinking you're communicating kindness when that might not actually be what you're doing. She'd rather have you talk to her for those 3 or 5 minutes, and that would be more kind. So it's the principle. Be kind, and you find ways to apply that, and a methodology that you hear in a counseling class. And that was probably a dumb example, but if you just focused on the methodology and you miss the principle, you're probably going to miss the boat.
And yeah, everyone is different. So there's not a cookie cutter approach of how to express, like you said, kindness or love. You really have to know the person in order to be able to do that effectively. And hopefully, premarital counseling could help train couples how they can do that and pinpoint and strengthen each other's, know their weaknesses and know their strengths and how to come alongside in that relationship. But you also brought up how this is one of the most stressful seasons in a relationship. And this is a bonus question I'm throwing in. But if a couple is overcome with stress, they may be toying with the idea of why not just elope? We're going to save money, we're going to save the stress. And maybe they're toying with that idea of just throwing in the towel on this long engagement phase. Can you give any counsel to a couple who may be considering that as an option of is this wise? Should they consider it?
Yeah, the eloping question is it's funny. My father in law offered me all the money he was going to spend on the wedding to elope. And I was willing. But Anne was not. And the reason she was not is she did not want to offend her mother, who was not in favor of that. And, they had one daughter and she wanted to have the party. And so I think elopement, meaning getting married without the big party, without the big hoopla, I fully support it. In fact, we just came through an era of history in our church where I actually participated in two weddings where that's what happened. And it was because of COVID. The government would not allow weddings to happen. And of course, people want to get married. And so we had one in our backyard, and I went to somebody else's front yard to officiate a wedding. And that was essentially an elopement because only the closest family was allowed to be there. And off they went. And everybody saved a lot of money. And it almost became a thing where people have started thinking about that as an option. The only thing to be careful of is you go through the process of getting married. Family is your family and your spouse's family are your family now for the rest of your life. And I don't think it is wise to make selfish decisions that offend family that you're going to be spending Thanksgiving with the rest of your life. And I think that is a consideration. There is no biblical prohibition. I still think it should be a wedding from the standpoint of vows are made to each other and in the presence of whatever witnesses, even just a few. But there is a solemnity to a wedding that is biblical. And that solemnity comes from the expression of vows and the commitment and the expression of the design of marriage being that of Christ. God designed marriage and Christ blessed it, and it is a very important ceremony. But the everything outside of that is hoopla. And so I'm kind of wandering here, but I think I'm not opposed to it. I saw it happen a lot in 2020 and 2021. And I've seen a cultural shift away from the big hoopla to a more simple process that is a lot less expensive and can happen a whole lot faster. And I'm all for that.
Okay. Well, I did not think you were going to say that. So, but I see your point, and yeah, COVID is definitely an interesting season where a lot of the normal ways of doing things had to change. I think the only thing I would offer on that or to think about is it is a gospel opportunity if you have unsaved family and friends that would be present where they would hear the gospel clearly presented if you're going to have the pastor share it at your ceremony. So that may be one of the only times that family, if they wouldn't set foot in a church normally, would hear the gospel. So it's an opportunity. And I know a lot of my friends that have gotten married have shared that that was an important thing for them. So maybe just something to consider in that. But yeah, you definitely would save money. That's for sure. If you
Yes, but you're right. And even during the COVID era, those weddings were either live streamed or recorded and sent out to family that were not allowed to be there. And I'm seeing there is opportunity for couples to do that. Now, let me address one other thing about elopement. Elopement tends to mean you run off to Vegas or you run off to the courthouse. Yeah, and that is definitely not what I'm talking about. I think there should be a pastor involved in some family, and included in that almost always is unsaved. Regardless, there is a presentation of the gospel, and that's the blessing of Christ. He equated his relationship to us, the church, with the marriage relationship. And to miss that in a wedding, as you have said, is a missed opportunity. Even if everyone in the room is believers, it's just such an important reminder. And I think that's maybe partly why, Christ affirmed the wedding ceremony.
Well, moving on here to another question, when a couple is moving from dating into engagement, there's going to be a change of conversation topics. There's going to be some topics that were maybe off limits in dating, and then now those are open to discussion. So, can you share what those topics would be that would change in that shift, and yeah, just give some guidance there?
Yeah. And in our experience, meaning Ann and I, spending a lot of time with couples in this phase, it's interesting. There's no standard anymore on what's talked about in the dating phase and what waits to the engagement phase. And sometimes there is no control over that. So parents might be intervening by saying to their son, for example, do you know this or that about this young lady? And that drives conversation. But I think that's just an example, but there's other external forces. And I just think dating conversations should be limited to things that should not include things, to be very clear, that are better reserved for engagement when that lifetime commitment has already been made. There's a covenant that's been made at the engagement stage. And to have conversations before that doesn't guard hearts and expectations. So there are disclosures that are made in the dating phase that if there's a breakup, now there's information with somebody that in hindsight you wish hadn't been put out there. And so I think the guiding principle is that you guard your hearts. And I know that's a phrase that everybody says, but the point is that anything that you would not want to have discussed with someone who's not your spouse shouldn't be talked about in the dating phase. As sure as you might be that engagement is coming. So, for guys, put a ring on it. If you want to have these conversations, there has to be a commitment that goes with that. The engagement day, if you will, is the doorway that you go through when a lot changes, and it's great. And one of the things is there is an intimacy at that point in conversation that there has never been before. And that's when you start talking about things like what is life going to, not from a theoretical standpoint, but from a very practical standpoint. We get to plan our life together. We get to lay out the vision for what this marriage and this home is going to be like. And so if the guys want to have that kind of conversation, they need to put a ring on it, as the song says. I've never heard this song, but everybody mentions it. And the ladies need to wait for the ring. And the obvious application of that is in the physical relationship. That's obvious. But I think there's an emotional attachment that happens in the dating phase, and it's wonderful. It is part of the process. I'm not saying you cannot invest emotionally at all. But there is a point of no return where there will be great regrets if there's a breakup. And in fact, some people are motivated to go ahead with a permanent relationship, even though they're unsure, because they have made so much disclosure and given so much emotional investment to a relationship that they feel like it's too big a loss to see it through. And that's what you want to protect yourself from. The engagement conversations really is everything. It's even down to practical. Where are we going to go live? I remember going to look at places to live. It's just so much fun. But doing that in the dating phase is really, it's the cart before the horse. And I know couples who have gone out house hunting together on dates. It's just not healthy. And some have even, they found such a great house that, well, we should just go ahead and buy it because we're not engaged yet, but we'll get there. And now there is such a financial commitment. There's a partnership that really you got engaged the day you made that decision. And it just puts things out of order. Engagement conversations get really rubber meeting the road on things like budgeting. Are we going to be able to survive? If transportation, whose car? Maybe we need another car. Sometimes it's two people that are in different churches, or one or the other has started to make a transition to a church. And now there's a discussion of, well, we're going to church together. And even if you're in the same church, if you're in different fellowship circles, that starts to change and that creates some tension because relationships, the potential wife here the hypothetical fiance here has a bunch of friends and they're very unhappy that she's going to leave their fellowship circle and join his, which means necessarily they won't see her as much. And that's something that isn't anticipated often as you head into engagement. But those are the kinds of discussions that start to happen in engagement. Yeah, and then there's the issue of kind of the elephant in the room, and this has grown in the last couple decades, it seems like, but discussion of the history of sin, sexual sin or other sin in the backgrounds. And when I say it's grown, it's just, it just wasn't that much of conversation, but our culture that's the language of our culture these days. And people seem to feel much freer to talk about that. And I think the timing of that conversation needs to be considered and the content of that conversation. And it seems to be an issue in a lot of dating and engagement relationships. And I always ask the question, let's say a young man comes to me and he says, I feel like I need to know this because I really like her. Things are coming together. It seems like we're moving a direction, but I need to know this. And I always do ask them, why do you need to know? If you love her and you want to make things permanent, what does her history change? And I'm not saying that there's a good answer or a bad answer, but there is an answer to that. So the why do you need to know? And basically what I'm getting at, Christy, is that if there is a history, for example, and it's all before they became a Christian, Christ already says it's as far as the east is from the west. So why do you need to know about it? And I'm not saying you can't, but you just need to think about that. And then if you do need to know about it, how much do you need to know or what do you need to know? And I think it's wise to limit those disclosures. And I often tell young men who, they're being asked these questions by a young lady. I always tell them, and that's typically where I'm having these conversations, which is why I'm going to say that. I realize your audience is the other half of the population, but I always tell young men, you need to think about what they're going to find out later from other sources. And if it's down the road going to look like you were being dishonest or incomplete, then you need to make that disclosure. In other words, you need to protect the relationship and protect your fiance, eventually your wife, from any possibility of her distrusting you legitimately because you did not answer the question. And I think now this is a difficult topic, and it's not just sexual history, but history of sin. We have people in our church that have a history of prison, radically saved, incredibly godly men now, and how much of that history really needs to be known. And if it's going to sway the relationship or the potential for the relationship, well, in some sense, if it's that big of an issue, then this isn't the person.
Yeah, that's a helpful point. And I appreciate how you're bringing out it's so important to be honest and to build the grounds for trust and being transparent. So are saying that once they enter into engagement, that's when, some of these conversations happen? Or do you think it's wise to have these conversations before that commitment level?
I think it's probably for most people important to have it before they make the decision to commit. And I understand that. But in the case where a little information is given and more is demanded, and that keeps happening, that's when I throw up the yellow flag and I say, yeah, I'm not sure this person knows you well enough or that you really are that close to a commitment where you should share all of that. Life is long, and I don't have any specific examples, but I'm sure there's things that Anne knew about me, and over a lifetime, more unfolds. And I'm not talking necessarily about sin, but about background and life, because you can't say it all before you get married. And I think it's the same for this issue, that history will probably unfold in greater depth once you're married. The issue for dating to get engaged is you're picking the one you're going to love for the rest of your life. And once that commitment's made, you love the one you chose for the rest of your life, to the exclusion of all others, regardless of circumstances. And I think you have to have the information to make that commitment. And if I'm the one being asked, I need to give enough information so that if more disclosures are made later, I have not violated that trust or respect.
Now, would you say, what if there's a case where there's current habitual sin struggles? Does that change the conversation at all? Is there a pause that needs to happen in the engagement process? What if things come to light that are more continuous?
Yeah, I think those are all legitimate reasons to push pause or maybe even to push eject. Because and I've kind of referenced that, if someone really struggles with a history of sin or current sin issues, understanding that none of us are a finished product. But if that's a struggle for somebody and it's going to be a struggle for somebody, that I would never recommend somebody get married to someone who views wherever you're at in that way for whatever reason. And it may be an oversensitivity, or it may be they just can't abide it. And, obviously that's easier to do before there's an engagement. But if there, to the extent there's appropriate reasons to break off an engagement, finding out current sin that you didn't know about or a spiritual condition, essentially that they misrepresented who they were, and you find out in the engagement period, for example, who they really are, and it's just different, well, that's fraud. That's just dishonesty. And I would say, that's a good reason to run.
That's a good point. Now, one other thing that you mentioned that I'd like to just go down this rabbit trail for a second. You said, you're choosing the one you love to the exclusion of all others. So, is that a conversation topic that can come up during this time of what does your friendships with members of the opposite sex look like now that there's a commitment? Because it doesn't mean that you won't ever be, now that you're engaged, you're protected from ever establishing a emotional or romantic connection to another person. And even in marriage, there's that possibility. So you have to set up those guardrails and those protections in a relationship. So what would that look like discussed in an engagement of how you navigate those friendships moving forward?
Yeah, well, the practical reality is it surfaces pretty fast. And, in my observation of life and relationships is that guys who invest a lot in friends who are girls before they get married are absolutely wasting their time, because those relationships generally don't survive engagement and marriage. Because in marriage, the man needs to give his wife every assurance that she is the one. And I think a woman deserves that. That's the biblical model. In the same way, a young lady who develops, extensive or even what you might say deep friendships with men before getting married, those relationships are going to go away. And so hopefully there's some pulling away from that in the dating process. And then in the engagement process, it becomes more pronounced because the focus of time and energy is so limited to one person, your fiance, that those relationships necessarily begin to, the relationships outside of those two relationships begin to break away. And it does cause some tension. It can cause some tension. I remember in our engagement period, I was very involved in ministry. I was teaching a Bible study in our college department, and it required a lot of time away from time with Anne. And I did not handle that well. I tried to continue as if I was still single. And that probably was true also in our dating relationship. It all runs together now, all these years later. But I remember us having very serious conversations, and me in my own heart and mind realizing I need to lock in on Anne, and some of these other relationships I can't devote the time and attention to, either now or in the long term. And so that transition just starts to happen. That's where premarital counseling comes in. The guy who thinks he's going to keep all of his golf buddies, and I'm just grabbing examples out of the air, or his football friends, and he's going to be able to hang out with his bros every available moment. That goes away, and if it doesn't, he's not ready to be married. That does become an issue, and it surfaces at some point pretty quickly, either in the dating or the engagement process. And it is a wise young man who understands his role as a leader and begins to navigate that for himself and to help her navigate all of that also.
Yeah. One thing I've heard from married women is that, they also, once you're married, you realize, well, I do still need female friendships because I can't expect my spouse to fill me relationally in every way. So there doesn't mean that you're completely cutting off friendships, from your life. And there's definite place for that. But it's changing, of course, and we all know that with, just like you said, the time constraints in a relationship. But specifically, I really appreciate how you brought out how a lot of the friendships of the opposite sex will go away. They'll just, they're not necessarily going to be these long lasting relationships. So kind of having that in view will help women, I think, if they're investing a lot of time right now in their single years in these relationships that, they might not be lifelong friendships.
Yeah. And, girlfriends for a young lady are probably for life, and guy friends for a guy are for life. They just aren't going to have the same intensity, because not only are you getting married, but should the Lord give you children, now you're consumed with that process, and there's only 24 hours in a day. So that's why I tell young ladies who are single, devote yourself to girlfriends. And I tell guys, devote yourself to guys, friendship with guys, and for both, ministry in the church, because those are the relationships that supersede life circumstances, and they will carry you through, and you will carry them through. It's the beauty of the church. Those are the lasting relationships that carry through life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really good point. I really like that quote. Now, let's say a couple They're walking through engagement, and one or both start to get a little nervous, and we hear the term cold feet. So, how should someone think that through if they're starting to kind of question? It's a big commitment, it's a serious lifelong commitment if they're kind of sensing they're getting cold feet on that commitment.
Yeah, that's where accountability of premarital counseling or an older couple is really, really helpful. I think the first thing I would say, I always think of Ecclesiastes 5 about making vows. Ecclesiastes 5:4, when you make a vow to God, do not be late in paying it, for he takes no delight in fools. Pay what you vow. It's better that you should not vow than that you should vow and not pay. Do not let your speech cause you to sin, and do not say in the presence of the messenger of God that it was a mistake. Why should God be angry on account of your voice and destroy the work of your hands? That's obviously focusing on making vows to God, but I view engagement even more than the wedding as the point where a vow is being made to God that I am going to love, in my case, Anne, for the rest of my life to the exclusion of all others. I'm committing to lead her, to provide for her, to protect her, to love her. And that for me was the commitment made at engagement. And I think, we press this point home when we do premarital that the commitment's been made. When that ring goes on the finger, when that young lady says yes, a vow has been made. And the wedding is important. I don't want to minimize the wedding. It is important. But from a vow standpoint, the wedding is somewhat of a formality in that you're simply memorializing the vow that was already made in public for everyone to see in the context, as you've said, the gospel and the that marriage is so important that Christ used it as an explanation of how to understand his relationship with us. It's so, and I've said engagement is the least romantic period of the relationship. There's a lot of stress, and that's normal. And I tell couples who are maybe starting to get this feeling of cold feet, I remind them of the commitment they made. I always want to take them back to what they know and let that dictate how they feel, not vice versa. It's really easy to get tired, stressed, and let that start dictating what you think you know. And in this situation, to avoid the cold feet dilemma, the future husband has an opportunity in this relationship to display good, gentle, and effective leadership, and for the future wife, the fiance, to trust and follow that leadership. And by that, I mean the young man, in my opinion, has primary responsibility to lead that couple to remembering what they know. And what do they know? That marriage is good, that it's fun, that there's a vision here of a family and a life together, the mystery of that life that you don't know when you get married, and the adventure that comes with that mystery together, and go back to the reasons why you were drawn together, and why you know that she is the one or he is the one. And in all of that, again, it's an opportunity for the man to lead, and to make sure both of them are not forgetting to eat, to sleep, to exercise, to maintain their personal spiritual disciplines of time in prayer, time in the word, fellowship in the church, accountability within the context of the church. All of that cannot be abandoned during the engagement period. And there's tremendous temptation to do that because of the stress. And when I talk about stress and pressure in engagement, I suppose some of your listeners might be thinking they have no idea what I'm talking about. And that's okay. You will, because you're balancing demands of family, your family, and now his family, who you don't even know. And, how many people can come to the wedding? What is the budget? We can only have 150, but we need we need to have 250 because we have so many friends. And, the budget means I can't get that wedding dress that I wanted. And whatever the case may be, and you can't find a church, or the weekend you wanted, the church isn't available. That's what I'm talking about in terms of stress. And usually both are either in school, or they're trying to wrap up school, or there's work. So that's the stresses that I'm talking about. And it's golden opportunity for a young man to lead. And Anne still remembers, and she always talks about this, decisions we made in our engagement in my attempt to do this. Like, we had a policy. I could see this thing was eating us up. And so I suggested, how about when we get together, we don't talk about the wedding at all. From the time I pick you up until I get you home, we can talk about the marriage, and we're going to talk about the marriage, but we're not going to talk about the wedding, which meant that we obviously needed to talk about the wedding, but it was done outside of our date time together. And yeah, I don't know if that's good or bad. Anne recommends it to everybody because it worked for us. And that may not work for everybody, but that's what I did to try and manage all of this. And we had wonderful dates together, great times, good discussion, and we never talked about the wedding in that time together. So there's things that can be done if one or the other is getting cold feet. If it's just based on those factors, that can be managed, and that's golden opportunity for one or the other of the fiancés to help the other and begin that knitting process. We're going to get to the finish line, and there is a marriage on the other side of all this.
Yeah. Yeah, such good points. And you're like you brought out the opportunity for the man to demonstrate leadership, and also just seeing how the couple works together as a team under pressure, because all of life's going to have pressure to different degrees. And like you talked about with children, and you add that into the mix, and that's going to create these dynamics. So seeing how someone responds and how they navigate pressure and stress, I think, could be a real bonding experience. And, in all of our times of when we feel weak, we know as believers that we go to the Lord for strength. We cast our cares on Him. We have to evaluate and make wise decisions with our time, but ultimately it's just another opportunity that God provides to lean on Him and see His strength come through, and see our character refined in those pressure situations. Now, we talked about this a little bit earlier, but appropriate reasons to break off an engagement. Maybe it's not just the stress and cold feet, but what would you say is an appropriate reason to end that commitment?
Yeah, well, you learn a lot in engagement. A lot of disclosure is made that you didn't have in the dating process. A real practical one is money. And I know couples that they start putting together and start dealing with the issues of money and budgeting, and what kind of an apartment can we get, or, what's our lifestyle going to be? And all of a sudden disclosures are made I can think of one case, hundreds of thousands of dollars of debt that was never disclosed, or all the way to how you get in the stress of an engagement period and you find out that your fiance is a crazy person, or that they drink when they're stressed, something that never manifested itself. Or, and this is pretty common too, none of these necessarily reasons to break off an engagement, but they could be. I'm just talking about what you learn in engagement. I don't want to paint engagement as, put your seatbelt on, you're going to find out terrible things. I don't want to paint that picture. But sometimes the things that are learned in engagement are concerning. Dealing with family, you find out that he's really not interested in leaving his family and cleaving to his wife. Depending on the depth of that and the seriousness of that, that might be a reason to consider a break in the relationship, because life with someone who is going to disobey that command, which is all the way back in Genesis. Even before sin entered the world, God laid that one down. And a young man who's not willing to do that it's very problematic. So, and I'm just kind of rattling through some issues that we've run across as we've helped couples through this. Those are the kinds of things that you'll learn in an engagement period. And what's interesting is you learn some of these stress points, which is some of the cost of marriage without all the benefits of marriage, because you're not there yet. And so you have to be really, really careful with this. And this is where another couple, some accountability, some outside perspective of people who knew you before you were married and engaged, or maybe at least walked through the dating process with you, who know you both well, can really help to navigate this kind of thing. And this is relatively rare, by the way. I want to make sure I say that. We're talking about outliers here. But, I know of one case where it became evident, and the young man eventually admitted it, that it was a total scam. He hid who he really was because he really wanted to get married. And it became evident in the process of engagement. There's people at Grace Church who went through the engagement period and went to premarital counseling. And in premarital counseling, it was exposed that one or the other was not saved. And by God's grace, got saved and they got married. And, there's couples I know today that you would never guess that happened, because it's just amazing. They've got kids and a great family. But, all of that, that's a very difficult decision point when your fiance says, you know what, I realize I'm not saved. And not even intentionally misrepresenting it. They thought they were. So all of that are reasons to maybe legitimately consider whether the marriage should go ahead. Obviously, a heavy involvement in pornography that was hidden. And, without going into the details here, but a mature older couple can walk through all the issues that represents. And by the way, that's not always the man. There's women who are heavily involved in that it has ramifications in marriage that both parties need to understand and walk through that. And often they walk into marriage knowing that's an issue and they're good. So those are some reasons to maybe break off an engagement, but it is relatively rare.
Okay. Yeah, those are helpful to think through. Now, one topic that I think is pretty popular, I guess, or at least I've heard it talked about quite often, is, do physical boundaries change during engagement? You hear often of, like, a couple will say, well, we're not going to kiss until we're engaged, or that seems to be the point where these things shift. How should a couple think that through? Do you have any helpful principles that can be applied to that?
Yes, I think it depends on what the pre-engagement boundaries were. I think the main principle I would say is that the biblical standard for purity does not change just because you're dating versus you're engaged versus you're married. The biblical standard for purity is don't sin. And the marital relationship, the physical intimacy of marriage, is reserved for marriage only. And that's a really basic, obvious biblical principle. I think of Hebrews 13:4 that says that marriage is to be held in honor among all, and the marriage bed is to be undefiled. For fornicators and adulterers, God will judge. Well, that makes pretty obvious what one of the standards should be in engagement. But the bigger picture is that marriage is to be honored. And to the extent that deciding that you can kiss during engagement, and again, I go back to the guys, they have primary responsibility for this, to protect the marriage, to protect their fiance and themselves from sin. And again, this is an area for the future husband to provide good and godly protection, to view this area not just what can we get away with and be okay, but to view it as Am I protecting the reputation of my future wife? Am I protecting the reputation of Christ and the view of Christ and the honor of marriage in our relationship? Those are the principles that I think guide decisions on what happens in engagement. And the other principle is, and I don't have a Bible verse for this particularly, but it's not seeing how close you can get to the edge of the cliff without going over. It's taking the perspective that in this relationship, we want to stay as far away from the edge of the cliff as we possibly can so that there's no question. And so, I always advocate for as short an engagement as you can do. This is one of the reasons. The stresses and strains of engagement is another reason. People that get engaged and say we're going to get married 18 months from now, that's dangerous on so many levels. And that's almost prioritizing planning a party over starting a marriage. And some of that thinking is that these boundaries, these physical boundaries, get really, really difficult to maintain over that period of time. God designed men and women, a man and a woman, to come together. And once that decision's been made and everybody feels like the commitment's been made, it's almost unnatural not to proceed pretty quickly in that direction.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, I definitely agree with all of that, Chris. And I think, just as we're talking about building trust in a relationship, and you don't want anything that's going to cast doubt in your mind on the other person. If they're not able to resist and have self-control and in the physical boundaries, then the rest of your marriage there could have that lack of trust. If they couldn't control themselves during that time, then would they control themselves during marriage, or would they be susceptible to outside temptation? So I think there's just like having the long view of what you're setting yourself up for. And like you said, just having the honor of the other person and their reputation as, primary in your mind. And also, of course, how does this reflect on Christ and my union with him? So really helpful to think that through.
And another thing that very few people think of in engagement, I certainly think of it now, especially as a grandparent, is what are you going to tell your children someday? And it's a tremendous blessing to be able, not that they want to know all of that in great detail, but when you're training and teaching and instructing your children, and eventually they ask or they enter engagement or they start thinking about boys. In my case, I had 3 daughters, that we talk about our engagement period and our relationship, and we're not hiding anything when we do that. And I think there's a great blessing in that. There's grace, obviously, if there's a fall in that area. I'm not saying that it's the end of everything. There's always grace, but what a blessing to be able to have those conversations and not have to hide sin from
Mm-hmm.
your children.
Yeah. Yeah. Great point. And I made this point in previous episodes, but just how hard it is to backpedal on once you know, cross certain lines. It's hard to say, okay, we're going to, go back to this line. So just don't even cross certain lines. Just stay away from, like you were saying, as far away from the line as you can. And don't put yourself in a position where you're going to have to go backwards. Now, as we've already talked about several times, engagement is busy, but how would you encourage couples to keep their priorities straight, that they're not just building towards this big party, this wedding day, but they're building the foundation of their marriage, their lifelong marriage together? So how would you encourage them to keep those priorities straight during this busy, stressful season?
Yeah, and we've talked about a lot of this. I think it's so important. It was for us, and I've seen it over and over, that there is a difference in importance and emphasis and in concern between the wedding and the marriage. And Very often, the woman is very focused on the party, the wedding and reception. And I have to say, there is nothing wrong with that. It's wonderful. For a lot of young ladies, it's something they've dreamed about for years, and they've pictured how it was going to go and enjoy it all. That's the joy of life. And that's the reward, if you will, of life. And I would never want to steal that joy. But the young man should avoid falling down that rabbit hole. And I shouldn't diminish it by calling it a rabbit hole. Hopefully, you understand what I'm saying. It's an attractive rabbit hole. It's an attractive trap, if you will. That if the young man and the young lady are so focused on the wedding, they may have fun doing that, but I think there could be regrets. And I think one or the other, and I would hope it would be the young man, keeps the relationship addressing the wedding appropriately, but focusing on life together. And that's really very exciting. It's joyful, especially when you really like the person you're going to marry. And I have never seen a case yet where that wasn't the case. But that's the person you want to spend the rest of your life with. You want to talk together about your commitment to each other, your vision. What is our family going to look like? Not just number of children, should the Lord give them to you, but what is the culture of your home going to be, and the big picture, the direction, where are we going to be in 10 years and 20 years? And by the way, I'll guarantee you, whatever you say at that point, that is not where you're going to be. But it's fun to think about and fun to talk about, because as you look back together on your relationship, there is so much benefit to keeping your eyes on that horizon rather than the road right in front of you. And you will remember that throughout your entire marriage, that your greatest memories will not of engagement will not be planning a wedding. And I'm not saying those are bad memories. Your greatest memories will be the discussions you had, and how either, wow, the Lord changed. Just we went down a road neither of us saw when we were engaged. Or you see, wow, the Lord gave us exactly what we hoped for. Isn't he great? So, and the other thing I think I would encourage a couple to keep their priorities straight in that time period is really working hard to preserve good relationships with what I'll call extended family. So, in laws. There's sometimes that through the tension of engagement and planning that party, things are said, things are done that extended family never forget. And again, extended family meaning my mother in law or my father in law. And it's just not worth it. You have to take the long view. These are your family now for life. And just like this marriage is for life. And so don't sacrifice any of that for an afternoon or an evening of a wedding.
Yeah, great encouragement, powerful exhortation to end on. And I so appreciate, Chris, how you talk about marriage in such just hopeful and exciting terms. And sometimes we can hear kind of the negative comments about marriage, but it is the joy of life that God did design this, and we can enjoy it and honor him through it. And so just appreciate the positive way that you speak about marriage and how you uphold it so well. And I know that this will be an encouragement to the people listening, and hopefully give them food for thought and maybe some ideas of how they can go about this season in a way that is wise and honors the Lord, and how they can enjoy it more fully, even though it's a busy time, but an opportunity for sure to just grow in your love for your fiance and your love for the Lord, and just showcase that for everyone who will be watching that relationship. So thank you again for your time. I so appreciate you coming on the podcast.
Thank you for having me, Christy. You do very good work. I hope it was helpful.